What a great music choice. How are you doing? How's your family doing? It's already October and days are getting shorter and it's getting colder outside. And it's been such a grind due to COVID and vaccine mandates and all of you also meeting the incredible demands for ever increasing need for psychiatric services. You've been all such a troopers, and I'm so proud of being the member of the department. But today, we really need to discuss the important topic about wellness. And today's grand round is titled The Five C's, Creating a Culture of Team-Based Wellness. Now, before I introduce the two speakers, I want to remind you of a couple of housekeeping items by which that you probably are now familiar. Microphones and cameras are off except for the presenters, interpreters for the panel. And please use the Q&A box on the toolbox for questions rather than the chat box. We keep them for the interpreters and technical issues. And Tziporah will ask your questions to the speakers at the Q&A portion of it in the last 10 minutes or so. And there are a few ways to provide your feedbacks and receive CE credits. We'll post a link in the chat in the form, and there will be also a link at the end of the presentation as well. And an email will go out with a link in the next day or so. At this point, let me introduce the two speakers. And the first speaker will be Tziporah Rosenberg, our Associate Chair of Education and Associate Professor of Psychiatry. She received her Ph.D. at Syracuse University and have done internship and fellowship at University of Rochester. She is our department leader in training and education. And she also serves as the Director of Interdisciplinary Training, which really reflects the values of our department: communication, collaborations, complementarity, competence, and compassion are 5 C's of our department. I'm so proud to work with her. She'll be followed by our lead wellness officer, Gallegos. She's our department wellness officer and also an assistant professor of psychiatry. And Dr. Gallegos received her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Fuller Graduate School of Psychology, and she also completed her internship and the postdoctoral fellowship at Rochester. She is passionate about faculty and staff burnout and wellness issues, and her clinical research and work, clinical work also is dedicated to interventions for psychological trauma with a specific focus on mindfulness-based stress introduction. We're very lucky to have her as our leader for this important topic of wellness. And together, Dr. Rosenberg and Dr. Gallegos will talk about the perspective and plan for the team-based wellness for Department of Psychiatry in times of COVID. Tziporah?
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Lee, and thank you to my co-presenter, Dr. Gallegos. I'm gonna get my slides up here to get us started. And while I'll be the first one speaking this afternoon, I'm actually going to give the first portion of the presentation over to Dr. Gallegos to get us thinking especially about wellness and to have an opportunity to share her vision. But as Dr. Lee had already mentioned, we are couching today's talk and today's session in a way that helps us calibrate to our North Star, which I'll talk a little bit about around the 5 C's, but also to talk a little bit about how Dr. Gallegos and I will be working together around this shared vision. So to that end, today we're going to do a few things and probably a few more, but at minimum, we're going to discuss some about the principles of effective teams, especially ones that are interdisciplinary and interprofessional, which is really most of our department. We'll consider ways to seek wellness opportunities in your particular area. And then we are also going to talk about some practical strategies for enhancing team-based care with a particular eye towards some of the ingredients of wellness that we'll cover earlier in the talk. To get us grounded and started, as Ben mentioned, our department's North Star, many of you have long understood that it really is the biopsychosocial model developed and described by Dr. Engel. And when we look at this particular paper from 1978, this has an interesting focus on interprofessionalism and training. Now, he didn't necessarily call it interprofessionalism, but he did focus on the importance of a department like ours really being a place for all of us to continue to develop, whether you're in training, whether you're a trainer, or whether you're already part of our staff or our clinical house. So in this particular paper, he describes these really as being key vehicles for living into that biopsychosocial model of care and of also experiencing ourselves as learners and teachers along the way, with a key focus on collaboration, communication, complementarity among all branches of the health professions. And then in addition, as Ben was saying, to buttress collaboration, communication, and complementarity, we want to be able to add that sense of competence, being able to do the roles that we have and to understand how we would apply the skills that we have from our respective disciplines in the service of that. However, since Dr. Lee has joined the department, I think he's especially focused on that last C of compassion, which, while Dr. Engel, I'm sure, had that in his heart, we certainly want to be sure that we are emphasizing the role of compassion, which, if anybody's listened to Dr. Lee talk about this, it really refers to our collective ability to sit with suffering and to be connected in the human experience of that across all of the domains of our functioning and work in the department. So on the note of compassion, I would like to hand off to Dr. Gallegos to get us started for this part of the presentation.
Thank you. Compassion is a really important element of not only our work together, our work with the patients that we serve in whatever role, in whatever capacity, but it's multidimensional in that it also reflects our own compassion for ourselves. And so I thought we would start today with just spending a moment to acknowledge our shared roles and our mission, our shared mission that we have in this department. And perhaps because we are sitting in separate spaces, perhaps we can start with an exercise in which we're acknowledging one another. So if you're willing to join me in just sitting, we can take a brief moment to acknowledge our collective stories, our collective work. And so one way we can do that is through a meditative practice. So if you're willing, we can pause for a moment during our workday, pause during this presentation to sit and be. So please join me in the sitting exercise. Start with just finding a comfortable posture. You're welcome to close your eyes. I will be. You can join me in that, or you can let your eyes fall out of focus. And we can start with just paying attention to our breathing. Noticing the inhale and exhale. This is a gentle reminder that we are not machines. We are human beings who each carry a story, our story of joy and fear, celebration and loss. Just taking a moment to Acknowledge your full self sitting here. And perhaps, if you're willing, we can imagine that each of these stories that we carry is a thread. The thread of your own story. Of joy, of suffering. And because of the work that we do, in whatever capacity, whatever role, we also carry the story of others. Perhaps you'd be willing to imagine those threads as well. Taking a moment to acknowledge that we are, though in separate spaces, sitting together, simply noticing our breathing, imagining these threads. When woven together, we see the size of the cloth. This is important work that we do. And if we were to imagine the size of this cloth, it's heavy. This is heavy work. This is hard work. Maybe perhaps we can imagine carrying it together. Gently opening your eyes. This is the crux of the shared vision for both Dr. Rosenberg and I, is to think about how to build up, how to support teams in a collective sense of wellness. That's where that co-creating wellness comes from. You can go to the next slide for me, Tziporah. We, as the wellness officer and chief of education, as well as our department, really want to ensure that our workplace embodies those 5 C's. And that's certainly imperative for a healthy, functioning team. I wanted to get a closer look at what an ideal work setting looks like. This comes from the Mayo Clinic and embodies or shows tenets of community, trust and respect, safety, control, and flexibility. These are the elements that make up an ideal workplace. I think it's important that we take a close look at our experience, maybe even taking a moment to think about your own experience of wellness at work. Perhaps you have had experiences in which you've experienced a lot or all of these. And the important question for us to ask is, what has made that possible? And what has contributed to that sense of unwellness at work? What has made these things not show up for you in the workplace? We'll go to the next slide. So the question is, how do we get there? This model really demonstrates important elements of my vision for creating a culture of wellness in the workplace. A culture of wellness implies these proactive efforts toward resilience and well-being, rather than reactive efforts to mitigate burnout. And so this requires leadership, efficiency of practice, and resilience efforts. Leadership is important in the way it promotes and prioritizes wellness. And so this can take a lot of different forms, from mentorship to engaging in empowerment exercises, like asking, listening, and empowering. And what I want to do in my role is to help essentially encourage leaders, support leaders to think about ways to prioritize wellness within their division, within the context of the clinic or the team that they're on. I've already started these conversations. I want to keep having these conversations because we are a large department and one size does not fit all. And so putting wellness at the forefront is paramount. And thankfully, based on conversations from our chair and our chiefs, I know that wellness is a priority, and we want to continue to make plans to implement wellness effectively. Efficiency of practice really highlights team-based wellness. This has to do with communication, positive interactions, and Dr. Rosenberg is going to give us really excellent examples of ways to enhance efficiency of practice. And finally, resilience. Too often, wellness efforts have over-focused on just elements of resilience and individual wellness as the crux of wellness in the workplace. Though it is not the only element, it is certainly something that we have to be able to focus on. I want you to think about wellness and resilience practices as something on your to-do list during the workday. And so that's something I'm going to review today, because resilience is something that we really can strengthen. We have to be able to recover from stressors and adapt to them. And certainly you've seen yourself, you've seen your teams have to adapt to incredible stressors during a pandemic. There's no way to say that any clearer. But being able to do that in a way that isn't just about surviving, right? But instead really thriving in the workday requires some resilience practices. So this can take a lot of different forms, from building practices of self-compassion, mindfulness, gratitude, maintaining a growth mindset. These are all important practices that I'll talk about in a few moments. We'll go to the next slide. It's important for us to think about the factors that contribute to burnout in our particular setting. For non-clinical staff, it might be elements of job security. For nurses, it might be difficult interactions with other team members, or by exposure to vicarious trauma. For physicians, it might be excessive work hours or low self-compassion. I think this is important to highlight that there are different factors that contribute to burnout. And when we understand that for each other, when we think about working on an interdisciplinary team, it's important to think about how different factors contribute perhaps to our unwellness or our burnout in the workplace. We'll go to the next slide. When we did the department wellness survey a year ago, we saw that workflow and tangibles were themes that were primarily reported as issues contributing to stress in the workplace. And that's important for us to consider thinking about ways to address both workflow, tangibles, but communication, appreciation as well. And so those things will come out as we think more about leadership, efficiency of practice, and resilience at work. We'll go to the next slide. It's also important for us, this doesn't come out in the other model, but for us to think about what other things contribute to vulnerabilities towards stress and distress in the workplace. That would be our identity and role as caregivers. And I think for our various roles and various disciplines, we are in this department with a shared mission that may be classified as being a caregiver. So that may make you have a more difficult time recognizing when you need help, and a more difficult time asking for help, or perhaps resisting help. And there's also a lot of work done around workplace wellness, around the concept of empathy versus compassion. And there used to be a concept of compassion fatigue, but that's really shifted to understand that it's more likely to be empathy fatigue, in that empathy allows us to feel the suffering of others, but compassion allows us to engage in pro-social behaviors like wanting to relieve suffering. But the important thing about compassion is that it can be directed toward not only others, but also yourself, to acknowledge when you can or cannot engage in relieving the suffering of another because of an important need to engage in your own wellness. So these are important elements that perhaps make us more vulnerable to unwellness in the workplace. And again, I want to think about how to foster things like compassion in our work setting. You can go to the next slide. Burnout among health workers takes many forms, but emotional exhaustion is actually has been found to be a primary driver of burnout. And something that's really fascinating about emotional exhaustion is that it also contributes to loneliness. And not loneliness because of social isolation, the loneliness of feeling disconnected in the workplace, not just from the people you're working with, like clients or patients, for example, but a disconnection, an inability to give or feel connected to the people that you work with. So again, I think this is another important way to highlight the vision that Dr. Rosenberg and I have in bolstering team-based wellness. Move to the next. Yeah, thank you. And just briefly, I think we know the cost of burnout. It not only impacts the organization, the patients, but it certainly impacts the worker, and has a multitude of health risks, not only again for ourselves, but for the people that we work with as well. It can drive things like attrition and racial health disparities. You can go to the next slide. So I want us to think about ways that we're going to promote wellness in our department. One is to continue with assessment. So you can look toward seeing another assessment in our department. This allows us to develop priorities for wellness and resilience. And we can, I want us to consider too, assessing leadership in being able to prioritize empowerment efforts. In promoting a wellness culture, like I said before, we really do have leadership that is committed to addressing primary sources of stress. And the way that we get there has to be co-created. And so we now have financial support for wellness efforts. And that can be accessed by team leaders, by division leaders. And you can also look for an RFA that I will put out for larger efforts to engage in wellness efforts for, again, your division, your clinic, or your team. And I want us to think about, again, team-based initiatives, ways to build teams, and to think about wellness spaces. That as we are growing as a department, that we are putting in place spaces that can be used for wellness. So one thing that I'm really excited about is transforming the playground to a staff wellness space. So we are in phase 1 of that process, that we will have, we'll be able to demonstrate changes over the next year. But Caroline Nestro and I and others are working towards starting that process of having a space that is dedicated to staff wellness. And finally, communication. In my role, I certainly want to act as both, to have a supportive role and a consultative role. I really do want to participate in the wellness efforts, to hear the things that you're already doing, and to hear ways that I can support the things that you either are already doing or want to be doing. And so one of those ways to communicate what's going on is that we're currently building a wellness website. And the other element is that I really want to encourage the use of WellU champions. And if you can go to the next slide. WellU champions are really an important liaison for a lot of activities that WellU has in building programs that can be brought to your team, to your department. And if you go to the next slide, I want to show an example of Strong Recovery, who has really engaged in using WellU. So Itza Morales and her team have a wellness room, and we can see an example of it here. I think those are some massage chairs in those chairs. They've also partnered with WellU to do gratitude challenges, hydration challenges, deep breathing challenges. They also emphasize the use of WellU and EAP. And something that I really like is that she talked about incorporating wellness and self-care into supervision notes. And I think that's an excellent practice. They also have a fun committee and look for ways to incorporate fun activities, as well as encouraging staff to participate in various challenges. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that what Itza has demonstrated is a type of leadership here that in incorporating wellness into supervision notes empowers her staff to not only do their job, but find ways to improve on their wellness efforts. This is an important leadership index that asks questions around both empowerment and mentorship. And a way that leadership can get there is through a process of asking, listening, empowering. And again, this is something I want to consider in thinking with leaders, is to look at these elements of leadership. Are there ways that perhaps they could bolster this process of really empowering the people that they work with to have a collaborative effort in wellness and on their teams? And if you go to the next slide, we can talk about resilience practices for the workday. And then Dr. Rosenberg will talk about, again, the efficiency of practice, or those team-based wellness efforts. Our resilience practices come from the Holy Book of Mary Oliver. And she says, instructions for living a life: be astonished, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So let's walk through each of these. Yeah. So attention and present-based practices work because they increase activity in regions of the brain that control stress regulation, like the prefrontal cortex, and decrease activities in our brain's stress alarm system, like the amygdala. But paying attention is also an imperative first step for health and adaptability, because without attention, we can't engage in goal-directed behaviors. So I want you to consider, either for yourself or for your team, ways to engage in meaningful pauses. Do you have breaks during the day? And certainly, how are they used is an important question. When you think about engaging in a meaningful practice for allowing yourself to essentially rest or return to homeostasis during the workday. There are apps to help you engage in that practice. I really encourage Headspace. That is an app I really like. There's also Calm. People talk about Insight Timer. And of course, paying attention to needing that extra support that you can get from EAP or BHP. Be astonished. There's really interesting work on awe and reverence. And what has been found is that awe cues us into shifting a perspective of what is possible and leads to reductions in stress and increases in positive emotions, including pro-social emotions like compassion and gratitude. What I appreciate about awe exercises is that it's something you can do briefly and within the workday. Every day, look for something that shifts your perspective of what is possible. Recent research has looked at awe walks during the day. And so perhaps there is an opportunity to engage in awe walks during the workday. I took a picture here from the Bridge Art Gallery, which I really appreciate in that it also embodies the growth mindset. We are still growing. You can go to the next page. And then finally, tell about it. So from Mary Oliver's instruction to tell about it, I take a lesson on a collective wellness. In other words, a team-based wellness, which Dr. Rosenberg will go into more detail about. But when we think about team-based wellness, it not only attunes us to our shared purpose, but it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge one another, acknowledge the work we're doing. And taking a cue from what Itza and her team are doing, acknowledging ways in which we're also not only accomplishing, but perhaps resting or engaging in self-care. Collective care is also demonstrated through mentorship, through seeking therapy if needed. Another practice that's not particularly difficult, but actually has a really important benefit is the practice of gratitude. And people who study gratitude find some pretty interesting things. One, it increases positive emotions and increases a sense of social ties. So when they study the language of gratitude, people often shift from a language of I to a language of we. And I want to take that concept of shifting to a language of we as we move to hear more about team-based wellness from Tziporah.
Thank you, Adam. It occurs to me too that I should say a little bit about how we arrived at this place of presenting this Grand Rounds together. In so many ways, the heart of the vision that Autumn is sharing is consonant with the vision that I shared almost a year ago in thinking about stepping into this role as associate chair, but also with an eye toward and a focus on interprofessional training and education. that when Autumn talks about wellness, she talks about teams being a vehicle. And when I talk about teams, I think wellness, of course, is part and parcel. And so what you're observing today is our attempt at doing this, the very thing that our title implies, which is that a co-creation of something, a blending of our visions to be able to move in the same direction, really stands to allow for each of our efforts to become exponential. And so on the heels of Autumn laying out so beautifully what some of those core principles are of wellness in a proactive sort of view, I'm going to follow up with some things really focused on our team environment, the fabric that Autumn walked us through trying to create in our mind's eye, the magnitude, the scope, the breadth of that fabric that she talked about, to me is a really beautiful metaphor for the size and magnitude and scope of our department. And while we can potentially pause and say, oh yeah, of course, we're all organized by teams, we're in all these groups, we have divisions and service areas and programs and populations that we serve, I really want to encourage us in an ongoing way, and through this role that I have in partnership with Autumn's, to focus on the how of our teaming, as opposed to coming in and focusing on our individual work, even if it's considered by program area. So the two foci that I'm going to highlight today, with probably a slight preference for the second one, is for one around interprofessional training, education, and practice, but also team-based learning and leveraging the best of what our teams have in order to enhance all of our missions for patient care as well as our experience of being in this place. So when I use the word interprofessionalism, I mentioned earlier that while Dr. Engel was describing really some of the core roots of it, it has been further defined and clarified, and I do want to call out a couple of important distinctions, not only for now, but as we're planting these seeds and coming back to cultivate them over time. Interprofessionalism really is comprised of two main components. One is focused on education, and so this is an opportunity to look at students or learners from two or more professions really having an opportunity to learn about each other, to learn from each other, and to learn with each other, to enhance and enable collaboration, but really ultimately with an eye toward improving outcomes for the patients and families and communities that we serve. And then the second component is really on that practice-related component. And while I may think that we are all lifelong learners, this one does differentiate away from the training arm or learner arm, and saying when multiple health workers from different backgrounds are working together, it really is our opportunity, again, to leverage what is best about each of us. And so this focus on the collective and on the interstitial sort of material as a way to enhance the power of any one of us is really, I think, where each of us is coming from in our talk today. When we look at interprofessionalism and team-based care, there are a couple of important principles, some of which Autumn has already talked a little bit about. But that segue from me to us, and especially in the face of a pandemic, I think is both vital and incredibly challenging. I'll talk a little bit about that soon. But the ultimate reality is that we can't not work in teams. Nobody on this call is working in an environment where we are doing so in absentia of others in our team, whether those people are with us in an exam room or at a bedside or out in the community or otherwise. We can't not work in teams. We have an eye towards safe and high quality care that really demands reliable teamwork and collaboration within our teams and across teams. Effective teams also do go to promoting some of those qualities of wellness and resilience that Autumn was describing, particularly around positivity and engagement. And I have a personal value around variety really being the spice of life. And while there is so much comfort in being in a room full of people who share my worldview, there's actually quite a bit more opportunity for creativity, partnership, and really excitement when we surround ourselves with other perspectives. So when we look at some of the broad categories of core competencies for this interprofessionalism in day-to-day practice, it focuses on 4 domains, but I'm going to spend the rest of our time today talking mostly about the last one. So we have a value that really is characterized by mutual respect and shared values, which is to say that we know what is important to us, we know what sort of centers us on that North Star, and that we share each other's perspectives. that roles and responsibilities are leveraged from our individual perspectives. I know what mine are, but I also know what are those of others, such that we can collectively decide who is the right person to do which thing and in which order on behalf of the patients and families and communities that we serve. That we communicate in many of the ways that Autumn was describing earlier, but we do so in a manner that's responsive and responsible, and that reflects that sort of team-based approach, which is qualitatively different than, frankly, how most of us were trained and how some of us may practice, but I do think we have opportunity to move in that direction. And last but not least, that we apply relationship building values, and this really speaks to intention, behavior, commitment, resources, all the things that that sometimes feel elusive time, but applying each of those in the direction of building relationship and supporting the growth of our team, not just the individual performance or even sort of individual program area performance, but in looking at how taking care of us as a collective can enhance our work and the outcomes. So generally speaking, when we look at the literature on effective teams, we know that effective teams are really characterized by several of these characteristics. The first being shared goals. We have in common that we are reflecting patient and family priorities, we reflect our departmental goals and missions, and that those goals are really understood by everybody, including the patients and families that we serve. That our roles are clear, that we know who is best trained to do what, but also where our opportunities for overlap may be, such that we can behave flexibly when the moment or opportunity or pandemic or crisis calls for it or allows for it. We have mutual trust in that, I mean, trust is sort of a tricky thing to deconstruct, and I won't go into the details of that today, but Autumn talked about it as a central component of resilience and wellness in the workplace. But this really speaks to our opportunity to feel like we are in a reciprocal, safe environment where we have permission to share ideas, to ask questions, such that we can reduce judgment and increase our cognitive flexibility and the way that we can team together. Effective communication, including not just what we say, but how we say it and how that exchange goes in a reciprocal sort of channel, not only around things that are going well, but also if and when there are problems that arise. And then last but not least, which I'll maybe say a little bit more about, that we have an opportunity to measure process as well as outcome related to the team itself. And this is one place where even if we have really good metrics about the work that we do and how many patients we see and the reduction of symptoms over time, we are not always or often attuned to the process of teaming. And it's a relationship that really needs monitoring and feedback as well. There are a variety of strategies to be able to bring to bear in the service of cultivating team. The shared mission and vision that I allude to on this slide, some of which is shared among us through the lens of our departmental mission. And some of it also is going to be adapted or carved out specific to the patient populations that you serve or to the areas where you're located. But we also want to be able to focus on the values among us within our team that are shared, largely focused on the quality of care, patient and family centeredness, humility and equity, for example. There are others, as well as what we each bring to bear individually in the service of those team-based goals. And as it relates to process, some of which we have talked about, but it really, to me, starts to invite questions about how do we talk about what kinds of things in our teams and in our groups? Are communications unidirectional? Are they back and forth? Do we have an opportunity for everybody to participate in a communication? Do we have regular meetings where we're not only seeing each other, but really fostering relationship and having an opportunity to revisit what are our mutual expectations for the work that we're doing and how do we give feedback about those things? When we look at team outcomes, there's going to be more to come, I think, as I further develop this role, focused on looking at objective measurement of how we do teaming. And again, I do want to look at these as a complement to some of the other metrics that we have, but we really want to be able to attend to the team wellness that Autumn and I think, are trying to create by learning about how do we measure it and assess it, how do we apply interventions in the service of bettering it, and how do we tell whether those things are working and helping. And we have some measures of this already, but I think we stand as a department to become more sophisticated in how we we do it. Including, I know we have a patient engagement survey coming up at the end of October, making sure that we have patient and family feedback as part of that loop and assessment process for how we are doing the work of teaming. I don't have to go into a whole lot of depth about the ways in which COVID has really fundamentally shifted the way that we team. And in so many ways, teamwork, no matter where you are in our department or which patients you have served at what point in time, and maybe you are not patient-facing at all, teamwork has become even more important, but at the same time, quite a bit more challenging. If things were not in COVID times, we would all be in the class of 62, huddled together over coffee or lunch or breakfast or whatever we have in front of us, to have that feeling of the fabric that Autumn was describing. But we have really seen sort of this bimodal experience, both where the centrality of team has become much more clear, but also it can be difficult to get to it. One of the upsides about crisis is that it can stimulate a spirit of collaboration and cooperation, but it's also true that when we look at the longevity of the experience that we've had, that persistence and feeling of stress and crisis can really sort of wear us down. And so as Autumn was talking about promoting resilience as a proactive sort of stance, to think about leveraging those goals at the end or wherever we are in this pandemic, I think is both admirable and I can appreciate will be challenging for all of us. We want to be thoughtful about the ways in which we have both experienced limitations in how we connect, but also seen quite a bit of adaptation and flexibility in terms of how the work gets done. So what I'm going to share now, some of these are seeds to consider, some of these are activities and things to maybe think about bringing into your next team meetings or retreats or other ways that you connect. But I want to invite some really basic, like introspective and reflective kinds of things, and then I'll give some suggestions for other to-dos. The first is a question that maybe sounds sort of obvious, but like, do we know who is on our team? And when I think about how I would characterize an effective team and how others in team science do the same, the extent to which we can describe the roles, responsibilities, and abilities of other people involved in our work, including what kind of training did they have, what is their scope of practice, is a demonstration of readiness for team and of team health and efficacy. But second, can we describe our own roles in relation to those others who are collaborating with us? So for example, how many of us can accurately sort of map out in a graph all of the steps that it takes to match a clinician in an outpatient setting with a patient sitting in front of us, whether it's on a Zoom call or in person, the sort of soup to nuts process of how all of that gets done. That is the embodiment of the teams that we have. And I think it's quite possible that, especially in the wake of COVID, we are in fairly narrow spaces to be able to appreciate the breadth of that and also the depth of skill that other people bring to bear in the service of those day-to-day functions. When I think about how our work will get done, this sort of begs questions like, to what extent can I see how my work and yours relate with one another? How do they relate together to the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Do I know those sequences that I was just describing, and do I know what it takes to make it work smoothly? Especially in times of stress, we can become so focused on where things don't go smoothly, with perhaps an underappreciation for how often things do go smoothly, and sort of the miraculous nature of all the things that it took to get there. We either miss it, or we miss opportunities to point it out and to share some of the gratitudes I think that Autumn was describing. Can we demonstrate the use of strategies and tools that facilitate effective communication and teamwork, including not only around successes, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but also when things maybe don't go so smoothly? And also, can we be thoughtful about the ways in which the language we use in a day-to-day really is a direct demonstration of the training that we have, the sort of slice of team that we participate in most often, but do we notice that there are times when that may get in the way? I have come to appreciate, especially working in academic medicine, how much jargon I use, and how if in the service of creating team, I find myself slipping into language that other people don't understand, I'm missing an opportunity to create the value around team that's most important to me. So what I'm going to wind us down with, I think, are very practical strategies, some of which are derived from a paper that's referenced at the bottom that was published during COVID as an opinion piece from Tannenbaum and colleagues, including Eduardo Salas, who's an IO psychologist who's built his career around team science. This is an opportunity for us to take note of what I think are relatively low-hanging pieces of fruit to tend to our teams with that eye toward wellness. The first being recognizing wins, not only the big ones, but small ones too, with an eye toward what they describe as collective efficacy. That's really different than self-efficacy. That's different than saying, I really nailed this, or you really did a great job with that, by shifting instead from me to us and saying, look at what we accomplished. What did it take for us to work together and leverage our relative skills and successes to be able to get there? Number two, to ensure that the team sustains shared mental models, including about our roles and priorities. What I've noticed during COVID is that some of these have shifted, and sometimes everybody knows they are shifting and sometimes they haven't. And so this idea about a shared mental model and knowing where we are going is vital to everybody being able to row in the same direction. Number three, to use huddles and debriefs to share priorities, to clarify responsibilities and decision-making authority, but also to figure out who is doing what and to what end, especially when we look at that collective. There are lots of us, I think, that participate in team meetings at some interval. There are probably fewer of us that have a regular huddle, especially in an outpatient setting. Handoffs and huddles may happen more often in our inpatient settings or in the CPEP, but the debrief in particular seems to have a special potency as it relates to retrospecting about the team process. How did we do in doing this thing that we just did? What can we do better or differently next time? And how do we want to be thoughtful about building it such that we can continue to improve in that Meliora spirit? Number four, this is one of my most important for me, focusing appreciation toward the areas behind the scenes and being really very thoughtful about how when we miss those opportunities, we start to sort of become at risk for things fracturing on fault lines by discipline, by function, or by group. And so when I talk about that sort of process, that cycle of how does somebody get in front of me for an appointment, it reminds me to be very thoughtful about the behind the scenes steps, some of which I might not even know, but this might be an opportunity for me to ask so that I can understand and express appreciation that way. Number five, to emphasize and promote team monitoring. And this is not like spying on each other to see who's not doing things on the up and up, but it is an opportunity to attune ourselves to how other people in our teams are doing. Research seems to show that effective teams successfully monitor at least three things: the situation as it's evolving, how we are doing as a team, but also the wellness and well-being of the people around us. It's probably safe to assume that many people on the call have had an experience of noticing in the last year and a half when somebody on our team does not appear to be doing well. And we may have private ways of addressing that. We may have thought about it but not done anything. And this reminds us that looking out for each other is actually vital to how we do as a team and accomplish our goals. Take actions that build and sustain psychological safety, which includes demonstrations of things like speaking up, admitting a mistake. This is especially true for those of us who are leaders. Acknowledging confusion and offering dissenting opinion without risk or fear that we'll be punished or rejected. If we want to promote creativity as a form of wellness and resilience and enhancing team, we need to be able to build and sustain these actions that allow for us to feel psychologically safe to do so. And then Autumn, I think, did a beautiful job focusing on resilience with a specific eye toward team resilience, which includes our ability not only to withstand adversity, but to recover from it and to thrive beyond it. Last but not least, a few additional strategies. If you are not already meeting as a team in any regular way, there is no better way to create relationship than to see each other in some form or fashion. Consider using maybe even silly or eye roll kinds of activities to get to know each other. Consider, as safety permits, what allows us to gather, and in order just to sort of build enough familiarity and comfort with each other to be able to do some of the higher level strategies. Consider asking questions about how other people function, and as time permits in your clinical area, to role share or to shadow those people. I've learned a tremendous amount, for example, noticing how nurses triage calls or what a front-end OAS might encounter on a day-to-day that really helps me sort of understand those behind-the-scenes functions, even if what I do in my office or behind my Zoom is really markedly different. And then I probably will end here with structured opportunities for appreciation and offering kudos. I sort of call it sometimes gratitudes and platitudes. And I think this is especially important for anybody on the call who serves in a supervisory or manager capacity, but it's really true for all of us. So when I look at those I care emails coming through, I'm always looking through to say, who do I know? Who have I observed? It is also a good reminder for me that I can and probably should create more of those myself as a public display of gratitude and appreciation for all of us who are working so hard. I have a couple other slides on here which I'm actually going to forego because as I've labeled them about risk, this really is about risk against disrupting the balance, disrupting homeostasis, or the way that many of us have always done things. And I'm going to do that in favor of having an opportunity, Autumn, to look at our Q&A box. And I know we have time for probably a couple of questions. I think this one is probably for you. The question is, what does workflow include from the survey? And does the wellness mission and mandate include addressing these workflow questions?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tony. Yeah, when the survey was talking about workflow, it was talking about specifically things like staffing concerns, scheduling concerns, like caseload, supervisor availability, administrative support, and protective lunch breaks. So this is where leadership comes into play. And an evidence-based practice, as I mentioned, is the process of asking, listening, and empowering. And certainly these are also sometimes concerns that we need to understand are within our control or outside of our control, perhaps however temporarily. But it is so important that there is a non-defensive and open practice and process for understanding what those workflow concerns are. Mm-hmm. For Itza's question, thank you, Itza. KORU is excellent. It is designed specifically for students. U of R does use it. So I would be happy to look at, if there's a way to translate it to the work setting. But I think the more important question is really getting something that is designed for teams using mindfulness. And I'd be happy to keep looking into that. And perhaps KORU is an excellent way to do that. And yes, we would want you to consider using funds for that, the funds that we have for wellness for that.
Well, I'm noticing our time, and on behalf of myself and Dr. Gallegos, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us. My expectation is that you can look forward to seeing quite a bit more coming out from each of us individually, but also collectively as we try to co-create this movement toward the 5 C's, but also with a focus on wellness for all of us in our department through the lens of team. And thank you so much for joining us. You'll note a link for today's evaluation in the chat, and the recording I think will also be live on the website after today's presentation. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a terrific afternoon.